This is the new iPad Air. It was announced in September, it's now October, and you can buy it. But should you? But before we get into whether you should or shouldn't buy the iPad Air, let's take a look at the specs. The iPad Air 2020 edition features the new A14 chip. This is the same chip that can be found in the recently announced iPhone 12. The iPad Air is available in one screen size and one screen size only, and that is 10.9 inches. Whilst there may only be one option of screen size, there are two options when it comes to storage. You can get the base model at 64GB, or you can go all the way up to 256GB with no 128 option in the middle. So only two options there. The iPad Air now comes in 5 colours: silver, space grey, rose gold, sky blue and green. The base model starts at £579 here in the UK or $599 in the US. So what's actually new about the 2020 edition iPad Air? The hardware. The overall dimensions of the iPad Air are roughly the same as the iPad Pro, and I say roughly. The width and the height are exactly the same. The thickness, however, is slightly different. There's going to be 0.2mm different between the iPad Pro and the iPad Air, the iPad Pro being the thinner of the two. Having said there is a thickness difference, you really are going to struggle to notice it even if you have them side by side flat on a table, so don't worry about it. The overall weight of the iPad Air is a little bit less than the iPad Pro in the 11-inch, but not by much. It's 458 grams for the iPad Air in the Wi-Fi model and 460 grams in the Wi-Fi and cellular, versus the iPad Pro, which is 471 grams in the Wi-Fi and 473 grams in the cellular model. When comparing the hardware of the Air to that of the iPad Pro, which is the most logical thing to do, you're going to notice a few small differences. One of which is the antenna lines on the back of the iPad Pro are now missing in the iPad Air, so it has a much cleaner aesthetic and in my opinion is probably nicer. But they don't bother me that much, and quite frankly the iPad Pro is covered by a case most of the time, as probably the iPad Air will also be. There is a slight difference on the speaker grills of the Air versus the speaker grills on the iPad Pro, and there is actually a difference on the hardware inside. The Air has stereo speakers where the iPad Pro has quad speakers, so if sound is important to you, then maybe the iPad Pro is the way to go, but quite frankly the volume and sound coming out of the iPad Air is very good, so make of that what you will. The iPad Air features dual microphones. You have one on the top and one on the back next to the camera. All in all, the iPad Air shares a lot in common with the overall look and appeal of the iPad Pro, but it has just those few differences. The display. The display is 2360 pixels by 1640 pixels at 264 pixels per inch. So what does this mean? Does it have the same screen or not? Well, no. There's a very slight difference in the size of the bezels around the screen. I'm talking very slight. You're not going to notice it. So again, don't worry about it. It's roughly the same size as the 11-inch iPad Pro screen. One difference you will notice, however, is the refresh rate. The iPad Air has a 60Hz refresh rate, whilst the iPad Pro is 120Hz. Now, that's not 120Hz all the time, so again, you're only going to notice it in some apps. The iPad Air is also slightly outperformed in terms of screen brightness, where it gets to 500 nits, the iPad Pro gets to 600. But unless you've got these two displays side by side, you're really not going to notice the difference. The iPad Air's display is excellent. Touch ID. When Face ID was first introduced on the iPhone X, many people thought it would be the end of Touch ID. However, it's lived on in iPads and some lower cost iPhones ever since. Well, the iPad Air takes it to a new level. It's a different kind of Touch ID now integrated into the sleep wake button. This means, as you might have expected, the sleep wake button is slightly bigger than that of other iPads. However, it's not massive, so again, it's not worth worrying about. What you should worry about is how good is the Touch ID sensor? Well, I can tell you from my testing, it works very quickly. Some reviewers I have seen have suggested that it takes a minute for you to rest your finger onto the Touch ID sensor in order to unlock it, but I think they're doing it wrong. If you come from an iPad Pro and you are used to tapping your screen to wake and then swiping up to unlock, then that combination is going to make it a little bit slower. Tap the screen to wake the device, rest the finger on the Touch ID sensor and then swipe up is a 3-step process, and it's a little bit slow. However, if you use the sleep wake button as intended, press it once and then swipe up, you're in straight away. The time it takes you to press the sleep wake button is also the time it takes Touch ID to recognize your fingerprint, and then you can just swipe up from there. So only a 2-step process and just as quick as Face ID. And to be honest, in my testing, sometimes a little bit more convenient. One thing to note, however, is because of orientation changes, you may want to register several fingers in your Touch ID sensor, so that if it's in portrait, you might use your right hand, if it's in landscape, you might use your left hand. Other small observations: if you have the iPad in portrait orientation with the Touch ID sensor in the top right of the iPad, then the Touch ID indicator is actually going to cover the battery percentage in the top right hand corner of the screen. In any other orientation, you're going to be able to see it just fine, but it's just something I noticed. Let me know down in the comments if you think that Face ID should be scrapped and this new Touch ID sensor should be brought over to the iPhone so that you can have a notchless screen. I think that'd be kind of interesting. I personally wouldn't mind to have Touch ID back on the iPhone, especially in this current climate of wearing a mask all the time. Face ID can be a little bit cumbersome. The camera. One key difference between the iPad Air and the iPad Pros is the back camera module. The iPad Air has one 12 megapixel wide camera at f1.8 and not a lot else. There's the microphone back there, but you don't get the LiDAR scanner, you don't get a flash, and you definitely don't get the ultra wide. So if you're in need of additional cameras on the back of your iPad, then it's got to be a Pro. Personally, I've almost never used either camera on the back of my iPad, and actually if they took it away and gave me a further 100 quid off the iPad, I'd still buy that one. So camera's not a big deal for me, but maybe with AR in the future I'll start using them more. We'll see. The front camera is a FaceTime HD camera and can take 7 megapixel photos with an aperture of f2.2. Accessory support. The curious thing about the iPad Air being exactly the same size as the 11-inch iPad Pro is that they can share a lot of accessories. So the Magic Keyboard only comes in one flavour that is both compatible with the iPad Pro and the iPad Air. Obviously, if you put it on the iPad Air, you're going to have a larger cutout where the cameras are, but they haven't made a specific one for the iPad Air. When it comes to smart covers, you have even more options. The iPad Air is capable of using any of the smart covers from the iPad Pro, as well as specifically designed ones for the iPad Air. So you've got a bit of choice there if you're prepared to put out with the additional cutout. The iPad Air also supports the Apple Pencil 2. USB-C. The iPad Air is now also USB-C, much like the iPad Pro. Interestingly, in the box you do still get the charging brick, and on this occasion it's 20 watts, whereas the iPad Pro is 18 watts. This means the iPad Air is the only Apple device that comes with the 20 watt charger required for the iPhone 12 fast charging. So if you're in the market for both an iPad Air and an iPhone 12, then you will have a charging brick for both. So what's the overall verdict? This is the iPad that most people should get, and most people probably will get. It has everything that's great about the iPad Pro. In fact, if you go and watch my iPad Pro video, if you haven't already, I will link it up here and down here, then most of the things on the good list are also applicable to the iPad Air, apart from the 120Hz ProMotion display. You get iPad OS, you get keyboard and mouse support, you get basically everything that's great about the iPad Pro, but for a couple of £100 cheaper. If you've been sitting on the fence for a while about getting an iPad Pro and you wasn't sure whether you needed that level of performance and maybe the cost was a bit high, Well, the iPad Air is going to answer that problem for you. The performance of the iPad Air is great, and honestly, it's not that far behind the iPad Pro. So unless you're intending to push your iPad to the limit with RAM intensive tasks, then the iPad Air is going to suit your needs. When I reviewed the iPad Pro, I said the biggest reason not to buy one was the 2018 iPad Pro. Well, now I think it might just be the iPad Air. If you like this video, then give me a thumbs up. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you would like more of this type of content, then hit that subscribe button. While you're down there, why not hit the bell? Otherwise, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.